This is the lecture on syntax part 2. So last time I introduced the idea of the phrase structure tree. If we look at this example again, the child found a puppy. We see here that each word in the sentence is labeled with a particular category label. So the is a determiner, which is abbreviated as DET. Child is a noun, abbreviated with N. Found is a verb, V. Another determiner, A, and then puppy, a noun. We can see from this tree also how each of the words are grouped together at different levels. So the child is grouped together and forms a constituent. Same thing with a puppy. Those two words go together. You'll recall from last time we talked about the constituency tests that allow you to see whether words form a phrase. So if you can move them around or you can substitute with something else, then it constitutes a constituent. And we can build trees of these phrases to show what the internal structure is. So we would start with the head of a phrase. That's the core of every phrase. In the noun phrase bright light, for example, the noun light is the head. Then there may be something occurring next to the head and elaborating on the meaning of the head. In the phrase structure tree, this is referred to as a complement. A complement can be a number of different things. For example, in the prepositional phrase over the river, the noun phrase the river is a complement of the preposition over. A third component that may be there is called a specifier, and these are elements that precede the head, that come before the head of a phrase. In the noun phrase the fish, for example, the determiner the is a specifier. It comes before the head. And so to generalize, using x as a variable ranging over all heads, all possible heads of a phrase, every phrase has the internal structure shown here, called the X-bar schema. We start with some type of phrase. In this diagram here, it's abbreviated as XP, but X, as I mentioned, is just a variable. It's just standing in for whatever this is going to be. So let's say it's a noun phrase. That means it would say NP at the top, and the noun as the head of the phrase fills in for the variable X. The phrase has two branchings. To the left, we have a slot for the specifier. And to the right, we have what's called the X-bar level. This is an intermediate level between the phrasal category at the top and X, or the head level below it. That X-bar level branches into the head, X, and then the complement of X. We're going to come back to this schema, but I want to say a few more things about specifiers and complements and which kinds of things we can put into these slots. So complements may be obligatory. It depends on what's called the selectional properties of the head. In other words, what the head of the phrase dictates you have to include or should not include. Specifiers are non-obligatory satellite elements. For example, an adverb of a verb. This is a specifier that's optional. You don't have to include it in order for it to make sense, but it adds extra information. So for example, the word always in always rents a car. We don't have to say always, we could just say she rents a car. Always, of course, adds more semantic information, but grammatically speaking, we don't have to have it, we can leave it out. Same thing with determiners of nouns. So you've probably noticed that sometimes we use determiners and sometimes we don't. So sometimes we'll use the word the or the word a. Sometimes we don't use those, as in plurals, for example, like the linguist shown here uses the determiner the. But if we had multiple linguists, we could say linguists study language, and there I don't use a determiner. So again, this is something that's optional and it is a specifier. Also, things like degree words, there aren't very many of these, but they appear sometimes before adjectives or prepositions, as in the example, very nice, or straight into the room. Those words very and straight in those two examples are specifiers as well. They are optional, grammatically speaking. Now, complements are sometimes required and sometimes not. It really depends on what the head of the phrase is. So some verbs require a noun phrase after them. These are sometimes referred to as transitive verbs. So for example, the verb find. This requires a noun phrase, as in Alex found the ball. You can't just say Alex found. It's not complete, right? You have to include something afterwards. So the verb find requires a noun phrase complement. The verb put requires both a noun phrase and a prepositional phrase as complements, as in Alex put the ball in the toy box. You have to put something somewhere. So that requires two complements. On the other hand, the verb sleep that we saw before cannot take a complement. So this is a case where complements are prohibited. The noun belief optionally selects a prepositional phrase, as in the belief in freedom of speech. That's a case where it's optional, so you can have this complement or you can leave it out. The adjective proud optionally selects a prepositional phrase, as in proud of herself. The term for this kind of information about what heads require as complements is called C-selection or subcategorization. And we all have this information if we are fluent speakers of a language. We don't always know that we know this, but the fact that we don't ever say Alex put, we always add the necessary components, indicates that there is some rule going on in the language that we follow when we speak it. It's also possible for a verb to select an entire clause as a complement. In other words, like an entire sentence, essentially. One verb like this is the verb say. For example, John said that he'd stop by this evening. That phrase shown here in brackets, that he'd stop by this evening, that whole phrase is called a complementizer phrase, abbreviated as CP. And now these rules about what type of things can be contained within a phrase can be laid out in phrase structure rules. And this can help us to build the phrase structure trees that allow us to see a sentence or phrase as a whole and to see the different levels. So here we have some of the phrase structure rules. Number 1, S standing for sentence, can contain a noun phrase and a verb phrase. In fact, it has to contain a noun phrase and a verb phrase at least. A noun phrase can contain a determiner and a noun, although remember that determiner is optional, grammatically speaking. And notice the N here on number 2 has that bar above it. That means it's the N bar level. It's that intermediate level. This will be easier to see when we get to the tree diagrams themselves. But that's a level that's in between the phrase level, the higher level, and then the bottom level that has the head in it. So I won't go through all of these, but it's useful to know that these exist, that these are the rules that we learn about our language to help us build sentences. We follow these rules all the time, every time we talk, without thinking about it. So let's revisit this phrase structure here. This is the X-bar schema based on this particular theory of syntax, the X-bar approach. We start with XP, with X standing in for whatever the type of phrase it is, so a noun phrase, verb phrase, whatever. That branches twice to a specifier on the left and X bar on the right. The X bar level, in turn, branches twice into the X, the head. So this is the word that heads the phrase. And then a complement of X. Now remember, in terms of whether there's a specifier or a complement actually in here is going to depend on those rules. It depends on what type of word we're using, if we're using a transitive verb or an intransitive verb or something like that. But this template here allows us to put all of those optional things in. We don't have to if the rules don't call for it, but we need some sort of template that allows us to build the structure for every possible sentence. This X-bar schema allows us to do that because it has slots for every possible thing that you would bring into a sentence. So let's walk through an example of a longer sentence diagrammed using this X-bar template that I just showed. Here we have the sentence, "The majority of the Senate became afraid of the vice president." We're going to look at this in 2 parts because it's kind of long. So right now we're going to focus on the first half of the sentence, which happens to be a noun phrase, "the majority of the Senate." So to break that down, notice at the top we have NP, which stands for noun phrase, which branches into the determiner the, and then that N bar level, which has majority labeled as a determiner, and then a prepositional phrase of the Senate. So what's important here to note is that the prepositional phrase of the Senate is modifying majority. That's why this prepositional phrase is branching off of that intermediate level. The prepositional phrase then branches into of, the preposition of, which is the head of the prepositional phrase. And then we have another noun phrase, the Senate, with the determiner the, and then finally the noun Senate. Notice we still draw that intermediate stage, the N-bar stage, even if there's only one word now coming out of it, as in Senate. And that's because essentially we're sort of showing our work here. And we want to be able to have the option to put something else in there if we wanted to. So what if it was the majority of the US Senate, where US is sort of describing which Senate we're talking about? Then that would be branching out of that N-bar level because it gives us that option. And that US, in that example I just mentioned, that would be a specifier. The next part of the sentence, became afraid of the vice president, is a verb phrase. It's headed by the verb became. And then we have an adjective phrase. These are a little bit more unusual, but they do exist. We have the head of the adjective phrase, afraid, which is itself an adjective. And then you have to be afraid of something, right, typically. So then we have the prepositional phrase, of the vice president, which has of as the head of it, the preposition of, and then the noun phrase, the vice president. So I talked about how that bar level allows us to insert additional items that we might want more specifiers or more complements, and we really use that a lot because most of the sentences that we say, many of them are actually pretty long. We use a lot of descriptors, lots of adjectives. So we need to be able to have some way to insert those. This gets us to the idea of recursivity. Recursive rules are rules in which a phrasal category can contain itself. One example of a recursive rule is that noun bar can contain an adjective and a noun bar. So notice the noun bar has another noun bar inside of it. And these kinds of rules allow a grammar to generate an infinite number of sentences. So we could, in theory, continue adding noun bar levels with new adjectives forever. Obviously, people don't do that because we have constraints on our working memory. Nobody wants to talk that long. So in practice, it doesn't end up happening, but we could go on and on and on. The grammar, the syntax allows for that. So for example, here we have the kind-hearted, intelligent, handsome boy. That's 3 adjectives, not infinite, obviously, but it's already getting to be quite a lot of those levels that you see there. So we start off with the NP at the top, because this is a noun phrase, the determiner, the, and then a series of N-bar levels with adjectives branching out of them. Kind-hearted, intelligent, handsome. And then at the end, we finish with the word boy, the noun, which is the head of the phrase. So if a noun is the head of a noun phrase and a verb is the head of a verb phrase, etc., what is the head of an entire sentence? Syntax has made some developments in this regard. One of the solutions to this problem is to use tense as the head of a sentence, as in past tense, present tense, whatever it is. And this is because all sentences have information about tense. This is true regardless of the language, regardless of the type of sentence. As long as it is a fully grammatical sentence, there is information somewhere about tense. So, we can say that tense is the head of a sentence, or in other words, sentences are tense phrases, or TPs, with T representing tense markers and modals. Different languages encode tense differently. English encodes past tense and present tense in the verb itself, but we also use modal verbs to convey future tense, like the word will. So English kind of does it both ways. The Romance languages, for the most part, encode tense information in the verb itself, so like in the verb endings, as in Spanish. But either way, there is information about the tense. So if we were to start to draw out a sentence diagram for a sentence using this idea of tense as the head, we would call the sentence a tense phrase, TP at the top, and then continue down with that same structure as before, branching out twice with the specifier on the left, and then the T bar level on the right. And that further branches to the T on the left, which is the head of the sentence, so the tense goes there, and then on the right, the complement. Using this structure with tense as the head, tense takes as an obligatory complement a verb, because you have to have a verb if you have tense. So let's see what this looks like with a couple of examples. Take the sentence, "The girl may cry." In this sentence, the tense is in that helping verb may. So we start out with TP label at the top, because this entire thing, remember, is a tense phrase, which is how we refer to sentences as a whole. And then it branches downward into a noun phrase first, the girl. And notice that's drawn with a triangle. That's really just sort of shorthand. When you see this triangle, it just means that it's abbreviating that whole big, longer structure that we could draw out the whole thing, but just to kind of not take up so much space. And because here in these diagrams, what I really want to point out is the tense part of it. So leaving that aside, the noun phrase, the girl. Next, we have this T bar level that contains the head of the phrase, may, that has our tense information in it. And then the verb phrase, cry. In this sentence, the girl may cry. The verb cry doesn't actually carry any tense information. It's may that tells us that it's going to happen in the future. Cry is just an infinitive form of the verb. Let's look at another example using past tense. So the child ate. Again, TP at the top, standing for tense phrase, branching to a noun phrase, the child, and T bar level, which has as its head past tense. In this example, the past tense is written with a plus PST. Sometimes you'll see that written in brackets. It's something that we don't actually say when we say the sentence. It's more, we know that this happened in the past, and we're going to end up encoding it in the verb. So that's why the verb that you see there is eat in the infinitive uninflected form. This diagram shows us, by breaking the whole thing apart, that the past tense and the infinitive form of the verb start out separate. And then when we go to actually say the sentence, we combine those, or we apply the past tense information to the verb eat, which in the case of this verb turns it into ate. Now, this is an irregular verb. We don't always make past tense that way, of course. We have to learn that at some point as we're growing up. But this same structure applies to any sentence, regardless of what the verb is. So, what is the point of diagramming all of these sentences like this? Well, one thing that it can help us to do is to understand why we have structural ambiguities in some of our sentences. These come up once in a while. Usually, in just regular conversation, we ask somebody to clarify, or the context tells us what's actually going on. But if we see a sentence that has two possible interpretations, what's really going on structurally is that there are two of those diagrams kind of competing in our minds. So let's take the example, the boy saw the man with the telescope. This has two possible meanings. The first meaning is that the boy used a telescope to see the man. So the boy was the one who had the telescope. The second meaning, though, is that the boy saw a man who had the telescope. So it was the man who was using the telescope. So these two different meanings are actually very different and could result in some confusion when you're telling somebody something like this. In this case, it's that the boy has the telescope or the man has the telescope, two totally different people. So again, each of these meanings can be represented by a different phrase structure tree or a syntax tree. And this is possible because the phrase structure rules allow more than one structure for the same string of words. So as a little challenge exercise, take a few minutes now, pause the video for as long as you need to practice tree diagramming the two meanings of the sentence, the boy saw the man with the telescope. Remember, there are two possibilities. One is that the boy is the one with the telescope, and the other is the man with the one who is the one with the telescope. And try to use the tense phrase structure that I just described. And that structure is shown here with this diagram. All right, I hope you were able to give that a try. It's a tedious activity, but it can really help to just sort of practice, try your hand at drawing out these diagrams to really help you understand what the structure is all about. So here we have diagrams of these two possible interpretations. On the left, this is the one where the boy is the one who used the telescope to look at the man. And on the right is the drawing corresponding to the meaning where the man had the telescope. Now, I hope you can see that really the major difference here is in where we put the prepositional phrase with the telescope. Is it branching off of the verb to see, as in the first one, or is it branching off of the noun man? The difference in where the PP is attached is what gives us these different meanings. So is it seeing with the telescope or is it man with the telescope? And that's the major difference here. So take all the time you need to study these and check and see if you got these, if you drew the same diagram or wherever you got stuck. These diagrams can also help us understand other things that happen when we speak. Like, how do we move things around in order to get questions or to change something from active to passive? So for example, we could say the boy is sleeping, but if we wanted to ask that, we would say, is the boy sleeping? Now in English, the way that we do this is by moving the verb is to the front of the sentence. So we change the sentence from a declarative sentence into a yes-no question that asks for confirmation of a situation. Now the words are in a different order now, but we still understand that they are related to each other, these two structures. The difference is where that auxiliary verb is. And we can see, if we were to draw out the declarative sentence form of this as a tree diagram, we would be able to see where the auxiliary verb is and how it moves to the front. So this approach to syntax, to sentence structure, has given some support to the idea of what's called universal grammar. This is the idea that there is a basic design for all languages. You could think of it sort of like a very basic blueprint. And then each language has its own parameters that get turned on or off depending on what the language is. These are just variations on the basic plan. Some of these features of all languages are that they all have structures that conform to the X-bar schema. So remember earlier I said that in order to create a template for drawing out sentences, it has to be able to have all languages and all possible parts of all the languages that can be inserted into this schema. And that's kind of what X-bar was meant to do. Also, all phrases consist of specifiers, heads, and complements. So that is related to the idea of X-bar schema. All sentences are headed by tense. So you can't have a sentence that doesn't have tense in it. All languages seem to have movement rules. So we didn't get too in-depth into movement rules, but in order to do things like ask questions or to change something from active voice to passive voice, there are lots of different ways that we incorporate movement into our syntax. So just kind of moving verbs around, changing the orders of things in a systematic way. We can't just change the order willy-nilly. We have to do it according to the rules. And those are the movement rules. And you can see movement rules in all languages. They're different kinds of rules, but there's still movement that goes on regardless of the language. The parameters that vary from language to language would be things like the word order within phrases. So heads and complements may be present in different orders across languages, but they all have those things. And I want to be sure that I mention that sign languages, of course, are fully fledged languages as well, and they have syntax just the same way that spoken languages do. They follow these same principles of universal grammar that I just described. They have auxiliary verbs, they have transformations, such as topicalization, which is where you move the direct object to the beginning of a sentence to emphasize it. They also have what's called WH movement that creates WH questions, like, where am I? That is a different word order than I am here. So that's another example of movement in English. Sign languages do this as well. And there are also constraints on transformation. So they have rules, not the same exact rules, but rules that govern what kinds of movements you can do. So, the fact that we see universal grammar in sign languages as well as spoken languages shows that humans are driven to learn language, that the human brain is designed to learn language, not just speech. So, speech is a medium by which we can communicate, but it's not the only one. We can also use signs. But what's interesting in terms of syntax is that we can identify a lot of these same principles, whether a language is spoken or signed.